the podcast and live stream of How to DAO, when we brief you about the newest and latest in the on-chain organization. Today, I would like to welcome Han, who is CEO founder and really pushing the digitization of organization for a couple of years already. And I'm glad to hear his perspective of what's the future of DAOs and future of on-chain organizations. Han came from traditional background, so started in Goldman Sachs, lived through the financial crisis, then started two successful startups, which he also exited. He might tell us his story about selling his, I think, the last startup before the Lehman Brothers actually failed, so right on time. And then pushing the boundaries with digitizing the organization, starting in Singapore, and now creating the latest venture called OtoCo, where any DAO can spin up LLC as a NFT. So, welcome, Han. Thank you
Thank you.
for being here.
Thanks, Booker. Really nice to be here. Yeah, so for all my sins, started out in TradFin, but like to think that I saw the light before crypto happened. I jumped out, started with some more traditional ventures in London initially, and then just at the time that I sold my last venture, I got the Bitcoin white paper sent, and that for me was like a road to Damascus moment. Not so much from an investment. Actually, regrettably, I should have probably piled in a lot a lot more, but more from a technology point of view, because I had seen the centralized approach with the data silos and the power of having access to data. When you work in an investment bank, you see both sides of the trade. I mean, there's no secret that that's how they make money, right? And so that actually comes because of the centralization of the data. And so for me, it was an eye opener, because this idea that you could basically clear transactions without a central authority was then still new, 2008. And look where we are now, right? Now we are probably less further advanced than I was hoping at the time. Even being there in the very early days of Ethereum, which I had the privilege to be there, a lot was happening in Singapore. Then we now fast forward into 2014. So I didn't do all that much actually in a couple of wilderness years where I was just reading a lot, reinventing myself from more of a finance guy to a technology guy, and having the luxury of time and be able to move around the world and so on. And so then 2013, I remember I started to see sort of the Ethereum idea taking shape. Now I remember I sent an email at the time. Vitalik was still responsive. I sent an email to Vitalik, and I was like, "Hey, Vitalik, surely one of your the applications for smart contracts could be um, putting entities on chain." Because if you think about a company, right, Hooker, a company is essentially a bundle of agreements, right? And at the time, I think it wasn't very controversial to make the thesis that smart contracts would be considered as contracts in the legal world under the legal analysis, right? It's just another medium by which you and I contract, right? And so I wrote an email, and Vitalik replied, you know how coders are suspicious of non-coders. He replied like, "Oh, great, Han. How much coding have you done?" Right? And so the answer was virtually zero, because I mean Solidity wasn't even fully formed. It was still very much in the making. But then we did get much closer as then Ethereum happened, and Vitalik then also came to Singapore when I was there. And so I hung around the Ethereum early days with a lot of the early, builders. We're talking here about like Maker, for instance, with Runa was there. I didn't quite get what he was going on about, but that turned into a fantastic story. And so that grew into a business which is now taking care of itself, which is has been helping a lot of people in the crypto Web3 space getting their entity set up around the world. Now, unfortunately, most of entity setup is still very analog. The registries are analog, the filing is analog. So that is a business called Autonomous, which I think some of the audience here will be familiar with, or I hope so. And we just set up if it's a crypto investment fund, we'll set that up like in the BVI, or if you need a development company, we'll set that up. We have a people bench that does all that, but can't be that automated. And so it was a couple of summers ago that I said, look, with the way we're doing this is all wrong. DAOs were then a buzzword, right? They've called a little bit like AI through waves, right? DAOs, people have high expectations, then they see it doesn't materialize. But as a concept of a new form of of organization, it's very appealing. And so I was thinking, we gotta get to a point where entities are natively created on chain, where you kind of press a button and hey presto, you got a legal container, a Lego block to play with, right? And that then became what initially was a bit of a hobby project during COVID, where I did code some smart contract suite that basically lets you just contract with a smart contract and spin up an entity by way of creating it. Okay. And now we're 2,000 something users further down the line with OtoCo, where at least the Web3 community almost expects that also the limited liability framework in which they operate and the legal entity that they're going to be using is on chain. Okay. And I think it's the future. I have no doubt it is the future. But as often is the case with technology, new technology, the biggest competitor is inertia, right? It's the inertia of the existing system where they insist that you notarize your passport copy, stuff like that, in order to spin up a legal entity that stands in the way. And so OtoCo is really now going into full automation of not just the setup, but the further stuff that you can do with your entity, from treasury management to spinning up tokens. So you can activate all these smart contracts essentially from within the OtoCo dashboard. Okay,
That's
that's kind of
super
where we are
cool.
today.
No, that's super cool, and I like the journey, like from like TradeFi, and you see how is it not working, and like basically the 2008 was the like year of Bitcoin in a sense, because the financial crisis and people like the early Bitcoiners were like, you know, the financial system is broken, we need some alternative to it, and the technology
Yeah,
basically
yeah,
got its adoption.
yeah,
And like everything has its time, and I was just listening to Horowitz recently, and like he said like that's the hardest part to basically know, like when is the right time to launch the technology you are building, because like
yeah,
if there is no financial crisis in 2008, Bitcoin might never take off. Like there
yeah.
was like that moment where like it converged, and like
I
with
think that's right.
that was like, yeah, there was this moment where like everyone wants to create a DAO, and uh you know I'm very bullish on DAOs still.
Yeah,
So but there is this like adoption curve, like there is this
totally,
hype cycle, then
totally.
the maturity
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
takes
yeah.
some time. However, I believe we are getting back on that traction out. But
Despite
what you
everything,
yeah.
right? Despite everything, Booker, because one of the things I find is very different Web3 from building in Web2 is it's a very ungrateful place to build in. Because if you obviously have a solid constituency of earnest founders, but it's so easy to be overshadowed by the pump and dump. It's so easy to be overshadowed by the shysters and the scammers out there, and it's just an ungrateful space. In Web 2, you have that sort of delayed gratification that you got your options that hopefully will be above the water. And if your startup that you joined early on works out over a couple of years, you got to be very well off as a result, right? In Web 3, you got this first payday almost at inception, and then there is no loyalty of the team. They move on to the. So I'm also quite skeptical about how we've done things in crypto. I feel like sometimes we've done this the other way around. We've done the hyper financialization first, and only now do we see actually earnest teams just sticking to it and building. A play like Safe, the Safe wallets that we all used, Gnosis at the time.
Yeah.
That is for me an example of how it should be done, right? Even with how they manage the token and so on. So but for any founder who wants to be in the space, it's a pretty ungrateful place too. But that's a side note. Let's talk about DAOs.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's a good point, like, about the evolution of the DAOs, because we went like extreme, like we went like over financialization and like immediate basically payday for the founding team. And
Right?
now we are getting a little back with like locking the tokens, vesting the
Yes.
tokens. And now like
Yeah.
we are getting, new businesses basically. It's not just a DAO or like token launch pump and dump. It's like a business. And like if
Totally.
you want to work for this business, you have these tokens, they are vesting for next 4 years. The difference is they're vesting like maybe daily, maybe hourly,
Yep.
and you can see
Yep.
how it's just streamed to you, which is
That's
which
right.
is also kind of like the innovation. And I
Yeah.
definitely like how we are kind of playing,
Yeah.
the extremes, and then we are finding the
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
middle
That's right.
ground.
Yeah.
uh and like I think this is a good segue to like, thinking about like how the organizations actually should be built, because I think you have very interesting take on uh how actually the legal entity stands within the DAO concept. And you mentioned also Rune from MakerDAO. So I used to work there as well, and I think he's kind of aligned with your strategy of like, the DAO and the legal entities kind of around. So can you
Yeah.
maybe like describe a little bit more like how you are thinking DAOs actually using
Sure.
legal
Sure.
entity for the purpose?
So my analysis, right? So away from opinion, let's try to put a thesis out there, right? Is that hopefully in not too far a future, we'll wake up and a DAO will be recognized as a body corporate, as a legal entity in itself, in its own right. Which means that everything we're doing now is kind of artificially shoehorning a DAO into an existing legal entity. But that's a transition period. And the way I think we're going to get to DAOs themselves being recognized as having limited liability, which is actually, by the way, a bottom up evolution. It's not that the state some centuries ago invented limited liability. It's something that's been growing organically from within the business community where people felt like, hey, if we're going to take so much risk, why don't we share the risk and limit ourselves to the capital we put in? So we shouldn't be like, oh my God, this is like a statist interventionist idea of limited liability. No, it's actually for your protection as an entrepreneur that you want limited liability. That's what it's all about. And you want to be able to have your entity transact as its own person rather than, oh, this is Pankar actually signing, and so he's liable for whatever is done. So what I guess I'm getting at is that we at some point in the future going to wake up and there's going to be probably a judge who will set the precedent that says this coordination mechanism of this group of token holders, if they transact out of, let's say, the DAO wallet, that is considered as a transaction from a separate legal person. And I think the
Mm-hmm.
way it's going to happen is from what is called international private law, not from some UN organization, not even from a foresighted government, like where you like to think that now the United States is definitely taking steps in the right direction. No, it's going to be international private law where a DAO will have done something in another jurisdiction, and a judge will say, well, we should actually consider that. We should make the presumption that this was meant to be done out of an organization. We're going to recognize it as such. Just like so many things have organically grown actually from international private law. It's more like natural law, they sometimes call it, right? It kind of bubbles up naturally. That is, I think, where the DAO ultimately is going to get its recognition from. This is very similar to what Balaji, who, by the way, invested in OtoCo, is trying to achieve with his school and with his nation, right? The digital nation. The big question there is, how do you ever get to recognition if you build a digital nation that only exists on blockchain? Well, this may just happen gradually over time, that suddenly there's going to be a recognition that a group of people who all own the same token are kind of part of a country, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a nation state that is purely digital. I think the same may happen with DAOs as a legal form. Okay, so that's the vision. That's where Musk wants to go to Mars. That's where we should be going, no doubt. How do we get there? This is where I have some issue with lots of the legal practitioners, which, by the way, I'm not, but they are really trying to shoehorn this DAO into like a Cayman Foundation or a Republic of the Marshall Island DAO LLC and so on, which I think has two disadvantages. One is that you're losing the benefits of being a DAO. You're losing the benefits of this totally flat coordination mechanism because you're shoehorning it in legacy legal structures that are a lot more hierarchical, where there's typically a manager, a
Yeah.
director, or somebody, right? So that's very unsatisfactory, right? In many ways, and then secondly, yeah, these legal structures weren't just meant to cater for the sort of decision making that a DAO is experimenting with. You know, the token holder, whichever modality you choose of token holder democracy, it just sits very uneasily with the sort of almost patriarchal approach of how companies kind of started to be used on a wider scale in the 19th century, let's say, right? Very patriarchal organization, the founder on top, etc. And so it's a very unsatisfactory state right now, but it's a transition state, is how I see it, where we
Mhm.
feel an approach that may be more helpful is not to shoehorn your DAO into a legal entity, but let a DAO control a legal entity. You know, and I think you and I talked about that, right, when we first spoke. It is very different in approach because basically it means that the DAO decides that for specific tasks it needs a legal extension in the real world because it is not yet recognized as a body corporate, and so
Yeah.
for those specific tasks you you start basically incorporating because you need an off ramp for your crypto, or you need employment and employees, you know. And
Hmm.
so you almost don't want to think about like the like a USB type hub where you plug in for certain things that you need done by the DAO. You make sure that the DAO or the sub DAOs have control over these entities, but that's very different from the DAO itself being wrapped into some artificial legal construct.
So from a
Okay.
practical perspective, like right now and what you are doing with OtoCo, but if I understand it correctly, like you're like, okay, the DAO is a smart contract. It might eventually like, be recognized as a legal entity in the future.
Hmm.
However, at the moment, what we are trying to achieve in the like transition phase, it's using traditional legal entities to help the DAO interact and be and have this limited liability with the real world.
Yeah.
So if I just picture it because I'm like a very visual person, it's
Yeah.
basically the DAO in the middle, and then the
Yeah.
DAO basically say, okay, I want this entity, like because I need to purchase a website,
Yeah.
or I need this entity because I need to, get some contractor from the real
Yeah.
world, and I
Yeah.
just want to limit my also liability when I'm interacting with this
Yeah.
real world. So if I go a little further, it's like the DAO, it's basically protected because every interaction which is doing, it's basically through entities which are
Correct.
around the DAO,
Correct.
correct?
Correct. Correct. And it's funny that you visualize it that way. I always visualize the opposite way, where the DAO hangs on top, like the holding, or if you want, you could call it like the ultimate beneficial owner
Yeah.
of the entity that is executing in the real world. But it's just the way you visualize things. But yeah, it's the DAO that controls. And so on a more
It's
technical
too
level,
hierarchical for me. I'm a
yeah, you
DAO
kind of
person, so I don't want anything to be
fair
hierarchical.
enough. Granted, granted. But I guess what I'm saying is that on a more technical level, right? If you, Pankar, can use your wallet that is owned by just you to contract to spin up a legal entity, then by extension, a DAO wallet can also sign, actually cryptographically sign, as the replacement of some wet signing, whatever that may be, to spin up an entity. And so the owner of the entity doesn't have to be an individual wallet; it can be a DAO wallet, and that's how you kind of get to the solution where a DAO wallet that's typically then a multi-sig, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
is going to be the controller of the legal extension in the real world and can start doing things. And then you can have all sort of decision making happening at the DAO level, whatever they decide to make decisions amongst the DAO token holders, it will be executed through that legal entity. And as a result, you create an element of legal buffer, of liability buffer for the DAO, right?
That's
Because the
awesome.
execution was done through a legal entity.
So my open
Okay.
question here is like, okay, so we the DAO through the smart contract basically create a legal entity, and then you know, like there is many people in the DAO. I want that legal entity to be like executing fast. Can I like add like kind of like three delegates, four delegates, kind of like a multi-sig
Yeah,
structure
totally,
to that
totally.
particular entity so they can interact?
Yeah. So let's say, for instance, that I mean, so typically, what you see is that more sophisticated DAOs will have these sort of sub DAO approach, right? Where let's say you and I we started a project and it grew into hundreds of thousands of token holders, or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously going to be super unwieldy for us to go to the 100,000 token holders on Snapshot and ask for their vote. So the first vote that we may have put out there would be, hey, are you guys okay that we have sub DAOs that take care of a specific area? It could be like treasury management. Okay, treasury management.
Yep.
Okay, the nature of the sub DAO, and this is kind of different from a working group, is that it can actually bind the DAO. So there's a delegation between all the token holders that says the sub DAO can make all the decisions that is going to optimize our treasury. Very common, right?
Yep.
So let's say you and I are the multi-sigs on that little treasury wallet. It doesn't even have to be big. And so what do? We may decide to spin up an OtoCo LLC because, hey, we need to open an account with a Coinbase to do some off-ramping, right? To get our hands on some fiat. Or we need to contract with an entity that requires a legal entity as a counterparty. And so typically that's kind of how it works without necessarily introducing a big level of hierarchy here, because you always have the ability for the DAO, the general assembly of the DAO, if you want, to revoke the powers of the sub DAO and say, no, no, you guys, you've done a good job, but now we got to do something else on our treasury. Done. And we are basically being folded up as a sub DAO. Okay. That is a use case that we see quite often. The other one we see quite often is an investment collective.
Mm-hmm.
So a group of people pool together, just send funds into a wallet. They add some governance rights on that wallet where there's kind of like an investment committee. Then the investment committee starts thinking about, okay, sort of an investment club where ideas are being bounced around. And then they start thinking about investing. And guess what? The first investment that they want to take is required that it would be signed by a legal entity, which is typically the case, right?
Yep.
And so none of these individual DAO token holders will want to put their name on there because it ought to be done from within the DAO. So you spin up an OtoCo and you sign the agreement for one particular deal. It could be whatever that is going to be done out of that entity.
I think this is
Does that make
actually a
sense?
very good use case because and also easy to understand. Because like if you have the investment now, it's hard for them to like capture the equity. Basically, they either
Very
do
hard.
just like straight token purchase because
Yep.
that's what they can hold in the multi-sig. But if there is
Yeah.
equity involved, it's then like hard. And like what you are
Yeah.
saying, it's not hard. Like the DAO can spin up legal entity, so there can be basically maybe even some token transfer, but the equity underlying equity can just go in that like LLC,
You got it.
whatever it is, and it's
Yeah.
connected to the DAO. So now the
Yeah.
investment DAO, it's actually getting more sophisticated because they don't need to invest only to liquid token project. They can actually invest into equity
Yeah. There can
projects,
be
which is good.
SPVs, could be feeders even into like funds. There's all sort of ways of permutation around this. But the key is that you have a collective and that coordination mechanism, which is also what you consistently sort of use as a way to describe the DAO, right? It's a coordination, it's a new way of coordinating amongst people.
Yep.
And so you preserve that coordination mechanism of the DAO without trying to force it into this more traditional, there is a board and then there is executive directors, et cetera, with all the the risk of agency that is well analyzed in literature, right?
Yeah.
The risk that an agent will basically go his her own way, do stuff outside of. So you have a much better way of letting the collective still decide on the key decisions,
Yeah,
and that is the
I'm
beauty of
very
it.
bullish on this, like, self-governance structures and kind of leaderless organizations in a sense, but like, with some help of the technology and some help of
Yeah,
the how information it's shared and decisions are made. But what I would like to kind of steer our discussion a little bit towards is like the latest development which is
yeah,
happening here in United States. We are both in United States, and like it's still the biggest market in the world. So like whatever is happening here, it's kind of like extrapolating to the rest of the world. And we have a basically very pro crypto government right now. So the first legislation went through the stablecoin, the Genius Act for
yeah,
stablecoin. Been at the Circle event, and they are super bullish now on like the on chain payments. But also what Jeremy, the CEO of Circle, said, it's like we think like in 5 years the most successful companies will start on chain. They won't start as a LLCs. They will start on chain. I was like very, very surprised. Like it's coming from institutional company
yeah,
basically, but
yeah,
like he's like, yeah, we are full on chain. We are like believing that's where we go in next 5 to 10 years. And now with Clarity Act, which is more towards like tokenization, and the SEC publishing that they want to make USA the basically crypto hub of the world and move all the like financial system, the legacy financial system they call it, to the new era. I think it's super bullish, and
yeah,
not just for the stable coins, but like we are talking DAOs here, and DAOs are like about tokenization and about interacting on chain. So I think this is great for our for our business, to help organizations actually get on chain and be more digitized.
sure,
But what is your like first take on it, and like how you think this will kind of play out in like
sure,
short term versus like long term?
sure. The way I look at it, right? But I want to be careful not to like opine. There's so many people who have opinions, so why would mine be worth any more than anybody else's? But let's try to kind of stick more to the analysis historically. When Jeremy, who I met way back in Hong Kong, was even at the time talking about stables, nothing had happened yet. Everybody was like, never going to happen, never going to happen, right? And then you fast forward a couple of years and hey, now stables is all the rage. But if you actually look at it, stable is just a subset of tokenization. We're just tokenizing fiat US dollars here. And if they do it the right way, hopefully it's collateralized one to one with an actual dollar. Okay. But I think where then you see now people saying everything is going to be tokenized, that is going to be the next wave. Okay, it's going to be stocks, it's going to be real estate title, it's going to be university diplomas. Everything ultimately is going to be wrapped up in a cryptographic token, and especially financial assets. And so what we're going to see is a tremendous co-opting by Wall Street of crypto in that respect. It's happening, right? It's happening with stable. It's going to happen with BlackRock doing another crypto fund. Actually, the fund itself is not investing in crypto, but it's a blockchain fund. It sits on blockchain. And so the technology is increasingly being used to create tokens that represent value, which is great news for everybody who's been around the space for a long time. It's been a long time coming because it will probably lead to further adoption of blockchains and crypto by the mainstream, as long as we manage to get the whole access to wallets under control. And I think that too is happening, right? Easier to make it, my parents, bless them, they're in their 80s, but they wouldn't be able to figure out MetaMask, for instance. That still has to be easier, but I think we're going there. That said, what we always need to bear in mind though is the original ethos of crypto, which I think risks being heavily diluted if Wall Street adopts and co-opts crypto. It's great that the technology layer is being used for me sending stable to you on the other side of the world, me tokenizing, a share of an investment fund in the Cayman Islands or the BVI. That's all great. But where does it leave decentralization? Where does it leave the ethos of, non-surveillance, privacy? I mean, look now at the court case, where Vitalik is still very concerned, and I think I share that concern about issues around, the surveillance of transactions, the privacy around transactions. It seems like that's almost a parallel world with a whole different agenda, and I think we should not forget that that's ultimately where we want to go. Decentralization, which is DAOs, and ZK for privacy and financial freedom is probably going to get a little bit lost when Wall Street is starting to co-opt crypto in a big way. Okay, so we shouldn't forget about that agenda, that we all want to be sovereign individuals who want to do their own thing without having to soon KYC ourselves where we want to open a self-custodied wallet, which, by the way, is where Europe may be heading with the whole MiCA and the further legislation, that there is effectively clauses there, and there is a segment in the European Parliament that was even proposing to KYC, basically forbid self-custodied wallets. Right. So that's the agenda that I'm currently like most concerned about. That said, everything that's happening here in the United States is positive, and at least there is a much lesser risk of being handcuffed when you step off a plane in JFK, right? Like it was at the time when Gary Gensler was offended for anybody who issued a token. So what I see here is that the community is happy to experiment, knowing that the enforcement regime, and now we have these recent acts that not only is the enforcement regime a lot lighter, the regs now actually help as well to make
Yeah.
more stuff possible. So I think this is going to be a phenomenal boom for crypto in the United States. No doubt. No doubt.
That's awesome to hear, and I think we should distinguish between the financial part, which is like the Wall Street part, which is
Yeah.
great. It brings the capital to the market.
Yeah.
However, that's not why we came here in the first place. We are not trying to like just move Wall Street to on chain, but like actually make it better.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
you mentioned, like the being sovereign individuals. Like, I feel like that's kind of the vibe of us, who are in crypto for a longer time. Like, we want to really like own ourselves, our own money, our assets, our identity. And
Exactly.
privacy, it's a human right.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people agree with that. At the Stanford event, the Commissioner Pierce, she said, like, the same way, kind of like, why we are so concerned about like private transaction on blockchain. Like privacy, it's normal. Like, if you
Yeah.
send email to someone, if I send you email, there is a privacy in that email. Nobody can read the email. It's
Yeah.
just for you and me. So why
Yeah.
I cannot send like private transaction to someone?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's really something what like we need to protect. And
Yeah.
obviously all there were concern like all the time, like during the email era, internet era, that it will be used by criminals. And at the beginning, it's mostly is, because they are the
Yeah.
most risk averse.
Yeah.
Like, they have
Totally. And we're
nothing to
gonna.
lose, so they use it. However, that evolves and mature, and we are getting in the age like where it actually getting giving benefits to the society at large.
Yeah.
So I really like that, like, you are like distinguishing between those two.
Yeah.
So we
There's a
like,
fallacy.
yeah, go.
Sorry. Go ahead. Go on.
No, so
No,
please go.
no, I was going to say there's a fallacy where people then easily say, yeah, but why? I don't have nothing to hide. I don't mind. And then soon, before you realize, you may get in a situation where you have nowhere to hide. Because, especially with AI, starting to analyze all your public transactions in a split second, it will map your whole life. It will just map your whole life, and it's going to be harvested for commercial purposes and, in the worst regimes, even political purposes. Right? We've seen it happen even in Canada. Remember when Trudeau was blocking the bank accounts of these truckers who were protesting at the time on the bridge there between. And I lived in Canada and I was abhorred by that. And so from nothing to hide to nowhere to hide is a very short distance. And so we need to bear that in mind when we work on crypto, that the next thing, voting, for instance, I believe in DAOs should also be ZK, in the sense that actually there's no need that my wallet should be linked to a specific way of voting pro or contra a proposal. You have the right to make that, a private vote, just like your vote in elections is private,
Yeah.
right?
No, I totally agree. And like, it's fine as you're saying, like I have nothing to hide. But like imagine you are living in the country where you have to hide, because otherwise if you
Exactly.
vote against the regime you will be just jailed or killed.
Yep.
um, and those systems are really working well for the top, like for
Yep.
basically the one who is in charge. And
Totally.
we don't want that. We want democracy.
Yep.
We want
Yep.
this to be rule of people. And if
Yep.
we need to ruling by people, we need to give them the freedom of opinion. We need to give them
Yeah.
freedom to own their assets and their privacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
part of it. So,
Absolutely.
and like we also, as you are saying, there's opinions, but there is an analysis. There is analysis that those systems in the long term overperform any autocratic or like any other regimes. It's just better because the people are more motivated, they are self motivated, they are making better decisions over time. And I feel like if we compare some of the countries today, like which are more democratic versus less democratic, we can see that the more democratic countries are winning, and
I think
really
that's probably
like,
true. They will outperform, but in the meantime, obviously, a lot of suffering. I mean, I'm sitting here 60 miles from Havana, and that regime is still intact. And how many more generations are we going to have to see the Cubans suffer where you can't even get a piece of protein a week? So, you know what I'm saying? By the time
yeah,
it does get outperformed by, I think it was Churchill saying, the democracy is the worst of all government forms except for all others, and it's probably true. But by the time that Cuba starts going the democratic way, a lot of people will have suffered. Venezuela is the same, um, China, arguably, I think there's a lot of suffering in China for people feeling quite repressed. If you go to Hong Kong now, you have a sense that people are actually self-censoring what they say. Whereas previously you could have a very free conversation. Now you see that self-censorship has entered. You know,
yeah,
people don't critique anymore. Anyhow, that's again on a tangent, but it does tie together with privacy. It does tie together, and AI is a big threat for privacy. There's a big risk it's going to be totally dominated by five, players. The crossroad, the tangent of AI with blockchains, I think is very, very, very powerful if we manage to keep transactions on blockchain private. So
yeah,
that could be the winner. Agentic AI that can start doing stuff from your wallet, but the transactions remain private. Where you basically, at some point, I think I'm going to talk to my computer and say, hey, can you send 100 USDC to Pankar for some development work he did or for whatever, and the thing is going to send it out of my wallet, and I'm going to use it almost as an extension of, it's going to be like a cryptographic banker if you want. But I want those transactions to remain private so they don't get harvested by the Googles and the Microsoft and so on and analyzed for everything.
yeah. So I definitely like, business transaction, like how much you pay for what, it should be private because it's a business like negotiation deal. And if everything
Yeah,
is public, then there is no
exactly.
negotiation needed basically.
Totally.
And like I like the segue to the AI, because like you also mentioned that, like, you feel like OtoCo can be also good use case for those AI
Yeah,
agents actually. And
yeah.
like how maybe let's get into it, like how actually AI can use OtoCo, and what's the benefit of AI agent having legal entity.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to say on AI. One is that we we see on the OtoCo side when people use OtoCo that they have a lot of questions, a lot of very basic questions actually about business, and that's fine. They're typically developers, they don't quite know how business works and so on. And so what we've done is with OtoCo, we built a kind of a playful AI. We called it Genko. I don't know if you watched The Godfather, but Genko was the first consigliere to the Godfather, like Tom
Yeah.
Hagen in the second Godfather. In the first Godfather, there's a consigliere to the Godfather called Genko. So we called our AI Genko. And Genko is like the person that you trust, you can ask questions about business. And we see that now being used by a lot of people where it's essentially what I call a conversational AI, where you just say, hey, do I need an EIN in the United States if I'm based in
Yeah.
Brazil? And so it gives you a very intelligent, very good answer. But we went a step beyond that, which is the agentic part of Genko, where you can actually do what I just said. You can instruct it by prompting to say, send 100 USDC, swap one ether into USDC and send it to Pankar from my wallet, and it does it. So it's an agentic thing. So that I think that is where the power of AI for blockchains will prove itself. This is an extension of our and the automation that comes with it. By extension, and to your question, is that there is nothing that prevents an agentic AI to then decide to actually wrap itself to incorporate itself. Let me
Hmm.
give you. Let's say you are a Tesla power pack that hangs on the wall of your house, and you're getting electricity from the roof, and it's stored in that battery pack. Okay, and when there's a surplus in the network, you can feed some of that electricity into the network. You get a price paid for it, and you could also receive electricity if you got a shortage and your house is at full AC because it's so
Yeah.
hot outside. There is no reason why the battery pack couldn't be a small LLC with that netting of income and revenue and expenses, run its own books, make its own accounting, and basically become a little business unit. Okay. And it may well be that an AI agent will decide to incorporate itself because for all sort of reasons, a self-driving car, a robo taxi. If you think about a robo taxi as a sort of an AI agent, if I would be that AI agent, I would decide to incorporate, because what happens if I do hit that old lady that I didn't see crossing the road? Where's the liability in that? So I think we're going to get to a stage sooner than later where AI agents decide, I want to spin up a company and have limited liability. Now, the only way that that can be done is if the companies live on chain. An
Yeah.
AI agent can't go to the registry in Delaware and present a bundle of papers and say, I want to become an LLC. But if you can spin up LLCs on chain, then the agent can perfectly execute the whole transaction.
This is an interesting use case. So basically, what you are, if I understand correctly, what you are saying, like if we have the Tesla, basically self-driving now,
Yeah.
and the each car will be basically autonomous in the sense
Yep.
that they will be their own legal entity. So if
Mm-hmm.
something happens, it crash, whatever, like it,
Yeah.
you cannot sue Tesla for it because it was this, only the car, it's own entity,
Correct.
and it's protected. Well, I think that's I think we
I
can
mean,
go
people
on
will probably
be
try
a
to
longer
sue Tesla, right?
discussion there.
Yeah, I know, but people will probably try to sue Tesla, but they will probably hit the legal precedent that says, well, the manufacturer is now not responsible for the use of the product. Depending who controls the product, a little bit the same way that Facebook is not responsible if certain feeds and certain contents pass through its pipes, right? That's been kind of the legal precedent. So I do believe that indeed people are going to start looking at that entity in itself, that agent. Is there liability there? Could we sue it? And so I think that the logical conclusion, if an AI agent indeed becomes ever more agentic and acts in the real world, that it's going to incorporate itself as a company, and we're going to see not hundreds of thousands of LLCs. We're going to see millions, if not tens of millions, of micro companies that are going to be spun up very quickly and give basically body corporate to that agent. You know, because what else is there? An AI agent is not yet a human being, and so you want to have that sort of self-sufficiency of an agent, and I think that's going to be a company, some sort of company.
So basically,
Okay.
the summary of it, and we are like a little bit at the time right now, but like I think Tesla should become a DAO. They already open sourcing their technology, so they basically can decentralize the whole company, and then every user will buy basically the Tesla, which they then own, and they can decide whatever autonomous agent they want to use for
Yeah.
the self-driving,
Yeah.
but it's not connected to the Tesla brand. It can be actually
Yeah.
open source agent from some other
Yeah.
brands, but that's basically on the user and the car side, and that's how we can get like around maybe some of the perceptions about, like, because in the at large, autonomous driving is safer, but
Yeah.
anytime something happens, it's a big deal for the whole brand, and they usually, have
Exactly.
problems for years. So this would be
Exactly.
kind of the way around
Yeah.
it. And like the government should care about the society at large,
Yeah.
not for like
Yeah.
individual incidents. So
That's right.
I really like that, and I think that's
Yeah.
some discussion we can
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
next time. So really
Can I
grateful
just
that
add
you.
one thing though,
Yeah.
Pankar, and then I do want to conclude and hopefully give like the key takeaways here. But you can almost hear people say, "Well, Han, it's clear that these AI agents want to incorporate to shirk any sort of sense of liability, right?" I think you got to look at it from the other side because you're giving a protection to these agents, a legal protection, more stuff will be happening, more stuff will be built, more people will be comfortable investing in new stuff. And it's going to be a sea change in innovation because you have more, just like at the time, the joint stock company, right, of the early 17th century made it possible that more capital was pooled, more stuff happened. I think that's going to happen now if indeed you see those agents having some sort of legal persona, because people are going to be more comfortable to let them out in the world, so to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if they do
So
something wrong, like they're liable, they're still liable,
yeah,
so we can
yeah,
fix them.
yeah.
No, like, thank you for the addition. And yeah, is there anything else I did not ask but you still want to kind of tell to our listeners?
No, I want to maybe just summarize for those who just fast forward to the conclusion. Right? Um, I think there's three things here that I would hope that people can kind of like distill from our talk. One is that DAOs will eventually have legal persona. I do believe that. So we don't have that sort of twilight zone currently, that transition phase where we got to shoehorn them in the legal. They're gonna be recognized as companies, organization with in their own right. So that's one. Second, um, companies will live on chain, just like stable is already on chain, just like other financial assets are. Company shares ownership is going to be on chain in the future. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing OtoCo. Okay, that is the medium on which companies will live, get started, and grow, no doubt. And then thirdly, the intersection of AI with blockchains is the killer app for blockchains, not for AI, for blockchains, because that is going to make agentic AI a lot more powerful, more private, and more decentralized. And I think that's what we should bear in mind. That's kind of what I hope I can sort of pass on to the audience here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Han. I totally agree with everything you said. Basically, you should reconnect with Jeremy because he's also
Yeah.
bullish that all the organization will open on chain, and he's receiving this book next week.
Great.
I just sent it to him.
Okay.
So like I think there is a lot of us in the space been for a while which believe like actually the on chain is happening now, which is
Yeah.
great to hear. And thanks again for the discussion, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Bakar. Thanks for having me. It
Thank
was really a
you.
pleasure. All right. Take care.